Hello. Happy Friday. Wah, it's Friday. Wah. Wah. I don't know why I'm wahing. How's everybody doing? See a couple names I don't recognize. Well, I recognize Six Flags Magic Mountain, but not as a person. And Xylane. Hello, you two, if there's anybody there behind those names. Wah, farmhouse. Wah. Wah. End of the week. No Sharkies just yet. Unless they're here and my chat hasn't refreshed, as sometimes happens. No puppy just yet. I think it's time for a chocolate strawberry. Welcome to my mukbang. No. Not that. Oh, it's a little wet on the bottom. Ooh. Ah. Nom nom. Chocolate strawberry. Our friends Noah and Trista and Logan very kindly sent us a box of chocolate dipped strawberries. Very tasty. Very good strawberries and very nice dark chocolate. Oh. I may need a napkin. I didn't think this one through. Hello, Sharkies. Happy Friday. Yes, it was very kind of them. How are the Sharkies on this not rainy Friday? At least it's not raining here right now. Very tasty. Although most of the chocolate fell off of it, so now I've just got a small cup of chocolate to eat. Oh no. Woe is me. You're normal. It is a day with no extremes for you. Normal's good. I think normal's underrated. Although that said, I guess it entirely depends on what your normal is. For some people, normal might actually be bad. A dentist trip and car insurance. Wow. That is an exciting day. Tasty chocolate strawberry. Strawberry. Nothing's better than strawberry. I have not yet watched Encanto. Apparently, We Don't Talk About Bruno has topped. Oh, I just saw Lilyfae come online. Has topped Let It Snow or whatever. Has topped Frozen's top song in, I don't know, numbers. Hey, Lilyfae, hooray! You just missed me eating a chocolate-covered strawberry. Yeah, I haven't really started yet. I'm glad you're here, because now I can show off the lovely thing you dropped off. I've been waiting to do this. I've been looking forward to showing everyone. Lily came by and left me with a lovely card. Thanks. I don't know exactly what she's thanking me for. Oh, puppy. Oh, puppy. Oh, puppy. Did Farmhouse finish the fries and now you came here to see if I have any fries? Silencio Bruno. Thanks for being awesome. With a nice heartfelt message inside. So, she brought me something that she stabbed over and over again while thinking of me lovingly. Everybody ready for this? Everybody ready? Whoa! Look at that. Oh, reflection of my screens. Look at that. Look at how awesome this is. It's big enough that like, it's so cool. It's got my name. Look at the details on it too. I love the gradient in colors. And the shading. And you can see the reflection of the webcam. It's so cool. Yes, I love it. It is fantastic. Wow. Wow. Where's... ah. So, this is definitely going to have to get a spot on the wall behind me there. Can you see the wall right now? Yeah, you can, if I'm in this way. I might need to shuffle things around a little bit so that it can have a good place. But for now, put it here. I don't think that's going to slide or fall or anything. I'll go there for now, and then between now and next Wednesday, I'll have to get a little nail, and it's pretty close to Durngal's. Get a little nail and mount it up there. Ah, so good. I love it. Thank you very much, Lily. High five. What? I don't have any else. That's it. Durngal's or Errol. Yeah, one of those. I had a tough time falling asleep last night. I tried to do my usual sleep reset thing within this past week or so, but it did not stick this time, unfortunately. And last night I couldn't fall asleep until 5:30 a.m. I tried. There was many hours of just laying in bed with a eyes closed. I seem to have a strange sort of, I don't know if it's specifically actually tinnitus or not, but like I'll have like a background ringing in my ears, and it's definitely much more noticeable at night when I'm, not distracted by anything else. It can get very loud, but it mostly gets loud when I think about it. Like if I recognize that the ringing sound is there and I like go like, oh, there's that ringing, then all of a sudden it'll get louder and louder and louder, which is kind of weird. So there's got to be some kind of mental component to it. I don't know exactly what it is. And sometimes I can, that therefore get it to fade somewhat by trying to distract myself and thinking about things and, I don't know, doing anything to like keep my mind busy. But if I notice it again, if I notice, oh, there's the ringing sound, then it starts to get louder again. Mr. Sharkey had the opposite. Couldn't stay up to watch shows. Oh, with Mrs. who was playing Skyrim. Fell asleep on the couch. Sometimes it's fun to, like, it's not fun, it's nice to doze while someone else plays video games or something like that. I know Farmos, that's one of Farmos's favorite activities, dozing while I game. No, I have always had trouble sleeping at night, which is not great. I've talked about it here before, but yeah, I tried to get myself back on track somewhat recently by just staying up all night. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, and this time it didn't stick. Probably partly because there were some things later at night, a few nights, that kind of threw me off of falling asleep at a regular time afterwards. So I like did my sleep reset thing by staying up all night and all day. But then a friend of mine needed a ride home from the airport, and I was supposed to be at like 8:45 p.m. So I agreed to that. But then her flight got delayed, and then delayed, and then delayed until 10:45 p.m. And so I went, at that point, like, we didn't really have an alternative, so went and picked her up at 10:45 p.m., but then we had to wait for her luggage, so I didn't actually get her home until 1:45, and I don't think I got home until after 1. So that, I think, was a big factor in throwing off my whole process. Mm-hmm. Normally Mrs. falls asleep while you watch a thing or you game, so the opposite this time. Pharma says tinnitus apparently does get louder if you focus on it. Something to do with those neurons firing more or something. Well, alright, so maybe it's just that then. It's not fun. I don't like it. Sometimes it's worse than other times, and sometimes it gets really loud, but I can just, deal with it. It doesn't bother me that much. Like, it's not something that, like, drives me crazy, but it's not a pleasant thing. Having some more black cherry juice with soda water. Sharky's has a relative with tinnitus. Talked about it recently. Never thought about it as more than an occasional ringing in the ears. Well, and if there's like background noise and things, or I'm busy doing things, then I don't know if it's there at all. Like, it's not a constant thing. Like, it might be very, very mildly in the background right now, or that might just be electrical devices that I'm hearing. But at night, especially, like when I'm trying to fall asleep, that's when it bothers me the most, or when it becomes the most noticeable and really like becomes present. Yeah, especially on those nights where I'm like having a lot of trouble falling asleep and I'm just laying in bed for hours not doing anything because I can't sleep, but I'm trying to sleep. Yeah. That's when I think I have the most time for it to make itself noticed. Boy. Fun fact. Even though pretty much everyone calls it tinnitus, it's maybe more accurately tinnitus, since it's not an actual itis, which would indicate inflammation. Tinnitus? 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 Relative was visiting with you a while ago, playing with the frequency generator app and showing us where he couldn't hear it. Yeah, some people abuse the fun facts. The fun fact system. I think some people will proclaim that something is a fun fact when in fact it is not very fun. And sometimes is not a fact. Showing you where he couldn't hear it. So, last two chapters, we read 2 chapters on Wednesday. We read 13 and 14. Because we got through 13, a little quickly, and then decided to just keep going. Which was fun, because chapter 14 was quite entertaining, I thought. What happened in, let's see, in 13, I believe, was when there were various meetings happening between the different kings of Sandaria, Drasnia, Cherek, Algaria, and Brand the Reven Warder. During the August 2015 power outage, Mrs. could really tell how much the usual electrical hum is around us all the time. So those meetings were happening, and Garion was not precisely welcome to all of them. So he got sent off to play in the armory, but on his way he noticed a certain Cherek in a green cloak that was acting somewhat suspicious. Didn't necessarily do anything outright, but was just, looking furtive and whatnot, and skulking around. Not like Garion. Garion wasn't skulking at all. Sharkies, there was a certain high frequency where his hearing stopped. It was earlier than the rest of us. Oh yeah, I can definitely hear the fridge, I think, right now. But I think I can also hear just ringing that is just my ears ringing. So that was, I think, the biggest thing that really happened in Chapter 13. In Chapter 14, there was, let's see, Garion went with Silk and Barak and Dernick down to the docks. There was some talk about the thing that had been stolen. That I believe, yes, they did not specifically name, but they said that basically the entire reason that Aloria was divided up into Cherek and Drasnia and Algaria and the Isle of the Winds was to protect a specific thing, and Garion posited that perhaps... There was a weird train horn just now. That was strange sounding. Garion posited that perhaps that thing had now been stolen, and it was that which they were now pursuing. And Barak and Silk noted that Garion was rather sharp. And then, while Barak was admiring his under-construction ship in the shipyard, that was apparently going to be the biggest ship on the water and was going to need to be manned by large burly Cherokee men in order to get it to move at all. Garion noticed some people his age sledding down a hill nearby, and so he went to join them, and a girl named Mady offered to let him use her improvised sled in exchange for a kiss. And then a big red-headed Cherokee boy came and got all surly and kind of threatened Garion a little bit, so Garion punched him in the nose and gave him a nosebleed. And then as Garion left after that, Mady ran over and gave him a kiss on the lips. Ah, boy. Unfortunately for Garion, his traveling companions all saw this and made a big deal out of it and teased him quite a lot. And then Beric told this story at dinner in front of all of the kings, and everybody was laughing and having a great time except for Garion, and also except for maybe Aunt Pole, who was not super impressed by that. Sharkies didn't hear about tinnitus until recently. So that's I think that's most of what kind of the anti-teens noise. I've heard about that. Sonic weaponry should be illegal. Oh, now there's sirens going out there. Maybe it wasn't a weird train horn that I heard. Maybe it was something else. Yeah, so I think that's... Oh, also, Garion spotted the green-cloaked Cherokee entering kind of a seedy-looking tavern with who he felt a connection to, Asherak the Murgo. Or possibly more accurately, Asherak the Grolim. And he tried to kind of broach this topic with the others, but found himself unable to actually talk about it. And he kind of tried to get around that, but it didn't really work. Taking advantage of old people's deafness. Oh boy. And I think that's roughly where we left off, with them heading back to the palace. Or no, they were already back at the palace, because the whole storytelling thing happened. Yeah, so the last thing that happened was Beric regaling everybody with the story of Garion's adventure on the snow hill. And Aunt Pole being kind of unimpressed with that, and Garion feeling rebellious. And, I don't know, Garion doesn't always act very responsibly when he starts to feel rebellious. I think we've seen that once or twice in the past already. So that's roughly where we're at. And it's 7:25, so why don't I get reading, huh? Chapter 15, everybody ready? Have another sip of my cherry soda. Need a stir stick to keep that mixed up. All right, we are on page 194 out of 262. So we're getting pretty close to the end. Chapter 15. Okay. The next morning dawned bright and crisp. The sky was a deep blue, and the sunlight was dazzling on the white mountain tops that rose behind the city. After breakfast, Mr. Wolf announced that he and Aunt Pole would again meet privately that day with Fulrak and the Alorn kings.
Good idea, Barak said. Gloomy ponderings are good for kings. Unless one has regal obligations, however, it's much too fine a day to be wasted indoors.
He grinned mockingly at his cousin.
There's a streak of cruelty in you that I hadn't suspected, Barak,
King Anheg said, making his voice too similar to Mr. Wolf's again. Let me try that line again. Let me think about it. How should I distinguish King Anheg's voice? He's a Cherek, so he's a bit big, but he's also, I think, lower. I'll try lower and less gravelly. How about that?
There's a streak of cruelty in you that I hadn't suspected, Barak.
How's that? Does that sound like King Anheg to you? King Anheg said, glancing longingly out a nearby window.
Do the wild boars still come down to the edges of the forest?
Barak asked.
In droves,
Anheg replied, even more disconsolately.
I thought I might gather a few good men and go out and see if we can thin their numbers a bit,
Barak said, his grin even wider now.
I was almost sure you had something like that in mind,
Anheg said moodily, scratching at his unkempt hair.
I'm doing you a service, Anheg, Barak said. You don't want your kingdom overrun with the beasts, do you?
He needs an assault rifle. Rodar, the fat king of Drasnia, laughed hugely. I think he's got you, Anheg, he said.
He usually does,
Anheg agreed sourly. He said overrun. That could easily mean 30 to 50 wild boars attacking the kingdom in 3 to 5 minutes. So, I think they need assault rifles. More sirens. Something's happening out there. I gladly leave such activities to younger and leaner men, Rodar said. He slapped his vast paunch with both hands. I don't mind a good supper, but I'd rather not have to fight with it first. I make too good a target. The blindest boar in the world wouldn't have much trouble finding me.
Well, Silk,
Barak said,
what do you say?
You're not serious, Silk said. You must go along, Prince Keldar, Queen Paren insisted. Someone has to represent the honor of Drasnia in this venture. Silk's face looked pained. You can be my champion, she said, her eyes sparkling. Have you been reading Arendish epics again, Your Highness? Silk asked acidly. Oh, can you see what's going on out there? Is it on the highway? Oh, yeah, now if I look that way, I can see flashing lights. I didn't realize it was from that direction. I guess something's going on the highway behind us. If you are looking to buy a house, I recommend not picking one next to a highway. If you can avoid it. I look forward to when we move to somewhere a little more... Oh, you can see the lights on camera now, actually. Or you could for a moment. Excuse me. Could you hear the siren too? Yeah, there's lots of them. Consider it a royal command, she said. Some fresh air and exercise won't hurt you. You're starting to look a little dyspeptic. There's the word of the day, everybody. Dyspeptic. Guess it must have been an accident if there was an ambulance. Silk bowed ironically. "As you wish, Your Highness," he said. "I suppose that if things get out of hand, I can always climb a tree."
"How about you, Dernick?"
Barak asked.
"I don't know much about hunting, friend Barak,"
Dernick said doubtfully, "but I'll come along if you like."
"My lord?"
Barak asked the Earl of Selene politely.
"Oh, no, Lord Barak," Selene laughed. "I outgrew my enthusiasm for such sport years ago. Thanks for the invitation, however." "Hettar?"
Barak asked the rangy Algar. Hettar glanced quickly at his father.
"Go along, Hettar."
Soft voice. "Go along, Hettar," Chohag said in his soft voice. "I'm sure King Anheg will lend me a warrior to help me walk."
"I'll do it myself, Chohag," Anheg said. "I've carried heavier burdens."
"I'll go with you then, Lord Barak," Hettar said, "and thanks for asking me." His voice was deep and resonant, but very soft, much like that of his father.
"Well, lad?"
Barak asked Garion. "Have you lost your wits entirely, Barak?" Aunt Pole snapped. "Didn't you get him into enough trouble yesterday?" That was the last straw. The sudden elation he'd felt at Barak's invitation turned to anger. Garion gritted his teeth and threw away all caution. "If Barak doesn't think I'll just be in the way, I'll be glad to go along," he announced defiantly. Aunt Pole stared at him, her eyes suddenly very hard.
Your cub's growing teeth, Pole,"
Mr. Wolf chuckled. "Be still, father," Aunt Pole said, still glaring at Garion.
"Not this time, miss," the old man said with a hint of iron in his voice. "He's made his decision, and you're not going to humiliate him by unmaking it for him. Garion isn't a child now. You may not have noticed, but he's almost man-high and filling out now. He'll soon be 15, Pole. You're going to have to relax your grip sometime, and now's as good a time as any to start treating him like a man."
She looked at him for a moment. "Whatever you say, father," she said at last, with deceptive meekness. "I'm sure we'll want to discuss this later, though. In private?" Mr. Wolf winced. Aunt Pole looked at Garion then. "Try to be careful, dear," she said, "and when you come back, we'll have a nice long talk, won't we?" Sharky say, reading Erendish epics, the way it said, makes me think they're romance novels. We'll learn about the Erendish Mimbrates. Is that right? Yeah, the Erend Mimbrates in time. We'll see whether that holds true when we learn more about the Erends. It's like the book gave me some stage direction for the voice. Yeah, after I finished, I should have read slightly ahead there. After I finished reading Hettar's, it gave me a little bit more. It doesn't do that every time, but it does occasionally. "Will my lord require my aid in arming himself for the hunt?" Lady Merrill asked in the stilted and insulting manner she always assumed with Barak.
"That won't be necessary, Merrill,"
Barak said. "I would not neglect any of my duties," she said.
"Leave it alone, Merrill,"
Barak said.
"You've made your point."
"Have I my lord's permission, then, to withdraw?" she asked.
"You have,"
he said shortly. "Perhaps you ladies would like to join me," Queen Islena said. "We'll cast auguries and see if we can predict the outcome of the hunt." Queen Paren, who stood somewhat behind the Queen of Cherek, rolled her eyes upward in resignation. Queen Silar smiled at her.
"Let's go, then," Barak said. "The boars are waiting."
"Sharpening their tusks, no doubt," Silk said. Farmo says, "Get out the Luigi board." I need to watch that one again. Sharkies, I was just about to say before you read it that I could feel the other queens roll their eyes. We could cast auguries. Barak led them down to the red door of the armory, where they were joined by a grizzled man with enormously broad shoulders, who wore a bull-hide shirt with metal plates sewn onto it.
"This is Torvik,"
Barak introduced the grizzled man.
"Anheg's chief huntsman. He knows every boar in the forest by his first name." "My lord Barak is overkind," Torvik said, bowing. "How does one go about this hunting of boars, friend Torvik?" Dernik asked politely. "I've never done it before." "It's a simple thing," Torvik explained. "I take my huntsmen into the forest, and we drive the beasts with noise and shouting. You and the other hunters wait for them with these." He gestured at a rack of stout, broad-headed boar spears. "When the boar sees you standing in his way, he charges you and tries to kill you with his tusks, but instead you kill him with your spear." "I see," Dernik said, somewhat doubtfully. "It doesn't sound very complicated." "We wear mail shirts, Dernik," Barak said. "Our hunters are hardly ever injured seriously." "Hardly ever has an uncomfortable ring of frequency to it, Barak," Silk said, fingering a mail shirt hanging on a peg by the door. "No sport is very entertaining without a certain element of risk," Barak shrugged, hefting a boar spear. "Have you ever thought of throwing dice instead?" Silk asked. "Not with your dice, my friend," Barak laughed. "We're rarely maimed." They began pulling on mail shirts, while Torvik's huntsmen carried several armloads of boar spears out to the sleighs waiting in the snowy courtyard of the palace. Garion found the mail shirt heavy and more than a little uncomfortable. The steel rings dug at his skin, even through his heavy clothes, and every time he tried to shift his posture to relieve the pressure of one of them, a half-dozen others bit at him. "I'll do it, but I'm going to complain the whole time." The air was very cold as they climbed into the sleighs, and the unusual fur robes seemed... I don't know why I said unusual. And the usual fur robes seemed hardly adequate. This chapter has a lot of different characters talking in it. Gotta get used to all the voices. They drove through the narrow, twisting streets of Val Alorn toward the great west gate on the opposite side of the city from the harbor. The breath of the horses steamed in the icy air as they rode. The ragged old blind woman from the temple stepped from a doorway as they passed in the bright morning sun. "Hail, Lord Barak!" she croaked. "Thy doom is at hand. Thou shalt taste of it before this day's sun finds its bed." Without a word, Barak rose in his sleigh, took up a boar spear,
and cast it with deadly accuracy full at the old woman. With surprising speed, the witch-woman swung her staff and knocked the spear aside in mid-air. "It will avail thee not to try to kill old Martier," she laughed scornfully. "Thy spear shall not find her, neither shall thy sword. Go thou, Barak, thy doom awaits thee." And then she turned toward the sleigh, in which Geryon sat beside the startled Dernick. "Hail, Lord of Lords," she intoned. "Thy peril this day shall be great, but thou shalt survive it. And it is thy peril which shall reveal the mark of the beast, which is the doom of thy friend Barak." And then she bowed and scampered away before Barak could lay his hands on another spear.
"What was that about, Geryon?"
Dernick asked, his eyes still surprised. "Barak says she's a crazy old blind woman," Geryon said. "She stopped us when we arrived in Val Alorn after you and the others had already passed."
"What was all that talk about doom?"
Dernick asked with a shudder. "I don't know," Geryon said. "Barak wouldn't explain it."
"It's a bad omen so early in the day," Dernick said. "These Charricks are a strange people."
Geryon nodded in agreement. Doom! What was all this talk about doom? Beyond the west gate of the city were open fields, sparkling white in the full glare of the morning sun. We usually have our bad omens after lunch. They crossed the fields toward the dark edge of the forest, 2 leagues away, with great plumes of powdery snow flying out behind their racing sleighs. Farmsteads lay muffled in snow along their track. The buildings were all made of logs and had high-peaked wooden roofs.
"These people seem to be indifferent to danger," Dernick said. "I certainly wouldn't want to live in a wooden house, what with the possibility of fire and all."
It's an interesting comment. I guess the houses in Sendaria must have all been brick. I don't remember that specific detail, but or stone. Well, they mentioned that they did mention that Geryon's father was a stone cutter, right? But it's colder here. That's a good point. "It's a different country, after all," Geryon said. "We can't expect the whole world to live the way we do in Sendaria."
"I suppose not," Dernick sighed. "But I'll tell you, Geryon, I'm not very comfortable here. Some people just aren't meant for travel. Sometimes I wish we'd never left Faldor's farm."
"I do too, sometimes," Geryon admitted, looking at the towering mountains that seemed to rise directly out of the forest ahead. "Someday it'll be over, though, and we'll be able to go home again." Dernick nodded and sighed once more. By the time they had entered the woods, Barak had regained his temper and his good spirits, and he set about placing the hunters as if nothing had happened. He led Geryon through the calf-deep snow to a large tree some distance from the narrow sleigh track.
"This is a good place,"
he said.
"There's a game trail here, and the boars may use it to try to escape the noise of Torvik and his huntsmen. When one comes, brace yourself and hold your spear with its point aimed at his chest. They don't see very well, and he'll run full into your spear before he even knows it's there. After that, it's probably best to jump behind a tree. Sometimes the spear makes them very angry."
"What if I miss?" Geryon asked.
"I wouldn't do that,"
Barak advised.
"It's not a very good idea."
"I didn't mean that I was going to do it on purpose," Geryon said. Will he try to get away from me, or what?
Sometimes they'll try to run, Barak said, but I wouldn't count on it. More likely he'll try to split you up the middle with his tusks. At that point, it's usually a good idea to climb a tree.
I'll remember that, Geryon said.
I won't be far away if you have trouble,
Barak promised, handing Geryon a pair of heavy spears. Sharky say, Dernick bringing some Samwise Gamgee vibes. Barak attempts to murder an old lady, then gets on with his day. Yeah, she just laughed it off too. Haha, that won't work. Nice try. A boar spear. Oh, you. Anyways, have fun with your doom. Handing Geryon a pair of heavy spears. Then he trudged back to his sleigh, and they all galloped off, leaving Geryon standing alone under the large oak tree. What does she look like? A boar? Sharky say, Barak trying to murder her. It's the running joke between them. It was shadowy among the dark tree trunks, and bitingly cold. Geryon walked around a bit through the snow, looking for the best place to await the boar. The trail Barak had pointed out was a beaten path winding back through the dark brush, and Geryon found the size of the tracks imprinted in the snow on the path alarmingly large. The oak tree, with low-spreading limbs, began to look very inviting, but he dismissed that thought angrily. He was expected to stand on the ground and meet the charge of the boar, and he decided that he would rather die than hide in a tree like a frightened child. I don't know about that one. The dry voice in his mind advised him that he spent far too much time worrying about things like that. There you go. Until he was grown, no one would consider him a man, so why should he go to all the trouble of trying to seem brave when it wouldn't do any good anyway? The forest was very quiet now, and the snow muffled all sounds. No bird sang, and there was only the occasional padded thump of snow sliding from the overloaded branches to the earth beneath. Geryon felt terribly alone. What was he doing here? What business had a good, sensible Sendarian boy here in the endless forests of Cherek, awaiting the charge of a savage wild pig with only a pair of unfamiliar spears for company? What had the pig ever done to him? He realized that he didn't even particularly like the taste of pork. He was some distance from the beaten forest track along which their sleighs had passed, and he set his back to the oak tree, shivered, and waited. He didn't realize how long he had been listening to the sound when he became fully aware of it. It was not the stamping, squealing rush of a wild boar he had been expecting, but was rather the measured pace of several horses moving slowly along the snow-carpeted floor of the forest, and it was coming from behind him. Cautiously, he eased his face around the tree. Sharky, oh, Farmo says his inner monologue is sounding a bit more Silk-like. Yeah, a little bit. And the Sharkies are saying he doesn't like pork until it's ham, perhaps. Hams. Three riders, muffled in furs, emerged from the woods on the far side of the sleigh-churned track. They stopped and sat waiting. Two of them were bearded warriors, little different from dozens of others Geryon had seen in King Anheg's palace. The third man, however, had long, flaxen-colored hair and wore no beard. His face had the sullen, pampered look of a spoiled child, although he was a man of middle years, and he sat his horse disdainfully, as if the company of the other two somehow offended him. After a time, the sound of another horse came from near the edge of the forest. Almost holding his breath, Geryon waited. The other rider slowly approached the three who sat their horses in the snow at the edge of the trees. It was the sandy-bearded man in the green cloak whom Geryon had seen creeping through the passageways of King Anheg's palace 2 nights before.
"My lord,"
the green-cloaked man said deferentially as he joined the other three.
"Where have you been?"
the flaxen-haired man demanded.
"Lord Barak took some of his guests on a boar hunt this morning. His route was the same as mine, and I didn't want to follow too closely."
The nobleman grunted sourly.
"We saw them deeper in the wood," he said. "Well, what have you heard?" "Very little, my lord. The kings are meeting with the old man and the woman in a guarded chamber. I can't get close enough to hear what they're saying." "I'm paying you good gold to get close enough. I have to know what they're saying. Go back to the palace and work out a way to hear what they're talking about." "I'll try, my lord,"
the green-cloaked man said, bowing somewhat stiffly.
"You'll do more than try,"
the flaxen-haired man snapped.
"As you wish, my lord,"
the other said, starting to turn his horse.
"Wait,"
the nobleman commanded.
"Were you able to meet with our friend?" "Your friend, my lord," the other corrected with distaste. "I met him, and we went to a tavern and talked a little." "What did he say?"
"Nothing very useful. His kind seldom do."
"Will he meet us as he said he would?"
"He told me that he would. If you want to believe him, that's your affair." The nobleman ignored that.
"Who arrived with the king of the Cendars?"
"The old man and the woman. Another old man, some Cendarian noble, I think, Lord Barak, and a weasel-faced Drasnian, and another Cendar, a commoner of some sort."
"That's all? Wasn't there a boy with them as well?"
The spy shrugged. "I didn't think the boy was important," he said.
"He's there, then? In the palace?"
"He is, my lord. An ordinary Cendarian boy of about 14, I'd judge. He seems to be some kind of servant to the woman."
"Very well. Go back to the palace and get close enough to that chamber to hear what the kings and the old man are saying."
"That may be very dangerous, my lord."
"It'll be more dangerous if you don't. Now go, before that ape Barak comes back and finds you loitering here."
He whirled his horse, and, followed by his 2 warriors, plunged back into the forest on the far side of the snowy track that wound among the dark trees. He's been sitting here in the cold, pulling himself up by his own bootstraps. The man in the green cloak sat grimly watching for a moment. Then he too turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. I feel like if I ever write a book, I'm going to need to bust open a thesaurus for an alternative to grim at this point. Now that I'm watching for it, I'm noticing how frequently it gets used. Geryon rose from his crouched position behind the tree. His hands were clenched so tightly around the shaft of his spear that they actually ached. This had gone entirely too far, he decided. The matter must be brought to someone's attention. And then, some way off in the snowy depths of the wood, he heard the sound of hunting horns and the steely clash of swords ringing rhythmically on shields. The huntsmen were coming, driving all the beasts of the forest before them. He heard a crackling in the bushes, and a great stag bounded into view, his eyes wild with fright and his antlers flaring above his head. With 3 huge leaps he was gone. Geryon trembled with excitement. Then there was a squealing rush, and a red-eyed sow plunged down the trail, followed by a half-dozen scampering piglets. Geryon stepped behind his tree and let them pass. The next squeals were deeper and rang less with fright than with rage. It was the boar. Geryon knew that before the beast even broke out of the heavy brush. When the boar appeared, Geryon felt his heart quail. This was no fat, sleepy porker, but rather a savage, infuriated beast. The horrid tusks jutting up past the flaring snout were yellow, and bits of twigs and bark clung to them, mute evidence that the boar would slash at anything in his path, trees, bushes, or a Sendarian boy without enough sense to get out of the way. Then a peculiar thing happened. As in the long-ago fight with Runderig, or in the scuffle with Brill's hirelings in the dark streets of Muros, Geryon felt his blood begin to surge, and there was a wild ringing in his ears. He seemed to hear a defiant, shouted challenge, and could scarcely accept the fact that it came from his own throat. He suddenly realized that he was stepping into the middle of the trail and crouching with his spear braced and leveled at the massive beast. The boar charged. Red-eyed and frothing from the mouth, with a deep-throated squeal of fury, he plunged at the waiting Geryon. The powdery snow sprayed up from his churning hooves like foam from the prow of a ship. The snow crystals seemed to hang in the air, sparkling in a single ray of sunlight that chanced just there to reach the forest floor. The shock as the boar hit the spear was frightful, but Geryon's aim was good. The broad-bladed spearhead penetrated the coarsely haired chest, and the white froth dripping from the boar's tusks suddenly became bloody foam. Geryon felt himself driven back by the impact, his feet slipping out from under him, and then the shaft of his spear snapped like a dry twig, and the boar was on him. The first slashing, upward ripping blow of the boar's tusks took Geryon full in the stomach, and he felt the wind whoosh out of his lungs. The second slash caught his hip as he tried to roll, gasping, out of the way. His chainmail shirt deflected the tusks, saving him from being wounded, but the blows were stunning. The boar's third slash caught him in the back, and he was flung through the air and crashed into a tree. His eyes filled with shimmering light as his head banged against the rough bark. And then Barak was there, roaring and charging through the snow. But somehow it seemed not to be Barak. Geryon's eyes, glazed from the shock of the blow to his head, looked uncomprehendingly at something that could not be true. It was Barak, there could be no doubt of that, but it was also something else. Oddly, as if somehow occupying the same space as Barak, there was also a huge, hideous bear. The images of the two figures crashing through the snow were superimposed, their movements identical, as if in sharing the same space, they also shared the same thoughts. Huge arms grasped up the wriggling, mortally wounded boar and crushed in upon it. Bright blood fountained from the boar's mouth, and the shaggy, half-man thing that seemed to be Barak and something else at the same time raised the dying pig and smashed it brutally to the ground. The man-thing lifted its awful face and roared in earth-shaking triumph as the light slid away from Geryon's eyes, and he felt himself drifting down into the grey well of unconsciousness. There was no way of knowing how much time passed until he came to in the sleigh. Silk was applying a cloth, filled with snow to the back of his neck as they flew across the glaring white fields toward Val Alorn. All right, let me catch up a little bit. Pharma saying, bleak, glum, grisly, austere? Austere doesn't seem quite right. I've always thought austere was more like serene. Somber, stern. That's a concussion. Wow. The shock as the boar hit the spear was frightful, but the snow was so delightful. This is... Wow. Sharky says science would call that superposition, if you remember correctly. And Pharma says austere is more somber-y, severe. Yeah, no, I didn't think of it as exactly the same as serene, but I've always kind of thought of it as like a mix of like serious and serene. But I guess maybe I'm just wrong. Superposition of man and bear. All right. Let's finish up the chapter. I see that you've decided to live. Silk grinned at him. Where's Barak? Garion mumbled groggily. In the sleigh behind us, Silk said, glancing back. Is he all right? What could hurt Barak? Silk asked. I mean, does he seem like himself? He seems like Barak to me, Silk shrugged. No, boy, lie still. That wild pig may have cracked your ribs. He placed his hands on Garion's chest and gently held him down. My boar, Garion demanded weakly. Where is it? The huntsmen are bringing it, Silk said. You'll get your triumphal entry. If I might suggest it, however, you should give some thought to the virtue of constructive cowardice. These instincts of yours could shorten your life. But Garion had already slipped back into unconsciousness. There's no gentle way to ask, is he a bear? And then they were in the palace, and Barak was carrying him, and Aunt Pole was there, white-faced at the sight of all the blood.
It's not his,
Barak assured her quickly.
He speared a boar, and it bled on him while they were tussling. I think the boy's all right. A little rap on the head is all.
Bring him, Aunt Pole said curtly, and led the way up the stairs toward Garion's room. Later, with his head and chest wrapped, and a foul-tasting cup of Aunt Pole's brewing making him light-headed and sleepy, Garion lay in his bed, listening as Aunt Pole finally turned on Barak. You great, overgrown dolt, she raged. Do you see what all your foolishness has done?
The lad's very brave,
Barak said, his voice low and sunk in a kind of bleak melancholy. Brave doesn't interest me, Aunt Pole snapped. Then she stopped. What's the matter with you? She demanded. She reached out suddenly and put her hands on the side of the huge man's head. She looked for a moment into his eyes, and then slowly released him. Oh, she said softly. It finally happened, I see.
I couldn't control it, Polgara,
Barak said in misery. It'll be all right, Barak, she said, gently touching his bowed head.
It'll never be all right again,
Barak said. Get some sleep, she told him. It won't seem so bad in the morning. The huge man turned and quietly left the room. Garion knew they were talking about the strange thing he had seen when Barak had rescued him from the boar, and he wanted to ask Aunt Pole about it. But the bitter drink she had given him pulled him down into a deep and dreamless sleep before he could put the words together to ask the question. And that's the end of chapter 15. That was an exciting one. And page 206 is chapter 16. It is 8:05. The next chapter is quite short. It only goes from page 206 to 214. So what do you think? Should I keep going? I don't want to be a bear! Not quite, but close. Seinfeld voice. Farmouse likes that you can tell how much Silk likes Geryon. If he likes you, he teases you more, while he's doing something nice for you. You have to keep going? Alright. Let's just power on. This is interesting. Good stuff happening. That was an exciting chapter. That's a very memorable one for me. That whole encounter with the boar and the bear. I don't know. Pretty interesting. What was that? Some fluff in my hair. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of something on camera. Farmouse agrees, that's a good one. The next day, Geryon was too stiff and sore to even think about getting out of bed. Puppy's on my spot on the couch. A stream of visitors, however, kept him too occupied to think about his aches and pains. The visits from the Alorn kings in their splendid robes were particularly flattering, and each of them praised his courage. Then the queens came and made a great fuss over his injuries, offering warm sympathy and gentle stroking touches to his forehead. The combination of praise, sympathy, and the certain knowledge that he was the absolute center of attention was overwhelming, and his heart was full. Stormy is sitting with you at the table. Oh, that's cute. The last visitor of the day, however, was Mr. Wolf, who came when evening was creeping through the snowy streets of Val Alorn. The old man wore his usual tunic and cloak, and his hood was turned up as if he had been outside. Oh. Kitty picture. I must stop and look at the kitty picture. Oh. It's not focusing, but the book is in frame as well. And there's a second picture of Kitty looking very, I don't know, content maybe. It's very cute. Such a cute kitty. I love black cats. I mean, I love all cats, but black cats are always so pretty. Alright, so Mr. Wolf showed up. Have you seen my boar, Mr. Wolf? Geryon asked proudly.
An excellent animal,
Wolf said, though without much enthusiasm.
But didn't anyone tell you it's customary to jump out of the way after the boar has been speared?
I didn't really think about it, Geryon admitted. But wouldn't that seem, well, cowardly?
Were you that concerned about what a pig might think of you?
Well, Geryon faltered. Not really, I guess.
You're developing an amazing lack of good sense for one so young, Wolf observed. It normally takes years and years to reach the point you seem to have arrived at overnight.
He turned to Aunt Pole, who sat nearby.
Polgara, are you quite certain that there's no hint of Arendish blood in our Geryon's background? He's been behaving most Arendish lately. First, he rides the great maelstrom like a rocking horse, and then tries to break a wild boar's tusks with his ribs. Are you sure you didn't drop him on his head when he was a baby?
Aunt Pole smiled, but said nothing.
I hope you recover soon, boy, Wolf said, and try to give some thought to what I've said.
Geryon sulked, mortally offended by Mr. Wolf's words. Tears welled up in his eyes despite all his efforts to control them. "Thank you for stopping by, Father," Aunt Pole said.
"It's always a pleasure to call on you, my daughter,"
Wolf said, and quietly left the room. "Why did he have to talk to me like that?" Geryon burst out, wiping his nose. "Now he's gone and spoiled it all." "Spoiled what, dear?" Aunt Pole asked, smoothing the front of her gray dress. "All of it," Geryon complained. "The kings all said I was very brave." "Kings say things like that," Aunt Pole said. "I wouldn't pay too much attention if I were you." "I was brave, wasn't I?" "I'm sure you were, dear," she said. "And I'm sure the pig was very impressed." "You're as bad as Mr. Wolf is," Geryon accused. "Yes, dear," she said. "I suppose I probably am, but that's only natural. Now, what would you like for supper?" "I'm not hungry," Geryon said defiantly. "Really? You probably need a tonic then. I'll fix you one." "I think I've changed my mind," Geryon said quickly. "I rather thought you might," Aunt Pole said. And then, without explanation, she suddenly put her arms around him and held him close to her for a long time. "What am I going to do with you?" she said finally. "I'm all right, Aunt Pole," he assured her. "This time, perhaps," she said, taking his face between her hands. "It's a splendid thing to be brave, my Geryon, but try once in a while to think a little bit first. Promise me?" "All right, Aunt Pole," he said, a little embarrassed by all this. Oddly enough, she still acted as if she really cared about him. The idea that there could still be a bond between them, even if they were not related, began to dawn on him. It could never be the same, of course, but at least it was something. He began to feel a little better about the whole thing. Oh. The next day, he was able to get up. His muscles still ached a bit, and his ribs were somewhat tender, but he was young and was healing fast. About mid-morning he was sitting with Dernick in the great hall of Anheg's palace, when the silvery-bearded Earl of Selene approached them. "King Fulrak wonders if you would be so kind as to join us in the council chamber, Goodman Dernick," he said politely. "Me, your honor?" Dernick asked incredulously. "His Majesty is most impressed with your sensibility," the old gentleman said. "He feels that you represent the very best of Sendarian practicality. What we face involves all men, not just the kings of the West. So, it's only proper that good, solid common sense be represented in our proceedings." Well, how about that? I like the king of the Sendars. "I'll come at once, your honor," Dernick said, getting up quickly. "But you'll have to forgive me if I say very little." Geryon waited, expectantly. "We've all heard of your adventure, my boy," the Earl of Selene said pleasantly to Geryon. "Ah, to be young again." He sighed. "Coming, Dernick?" Ouch. Lily says, "Ah, to be young again." Mr. Sharkey has been thinking all through this part that Geryon has been talking so much about his boar, but not mentioning the spy, which he has previously committed in thought to speak about. Yes, well, that was very quickly followed by a lot of adrenaline, and then probably a concussion. So, I think it's understandable to forget something like that. Geryon sat alone, wounded to the quick by his exclusion. He was at an age where his self-esteem was very tender, and inwardly he writhed at the lack of regard implicit in his not being invited to join them. Hurt and offended, he sulkily left the great hall and went to visit his boar, which hung in an ice-filled cooling room just off the kitchen. At least the boar had taken him seriously. Uninjured. I don't know if you were paying attention in the last couple chapters. Capable of healing quickly, maybe. He was uninjured before the boar. Oh. One could, however, spend only so much time in the company of a dead pig without becoming depressed. That's what I always say. The boar did not seem nearly so big as he had when he was alive and charging, and the tusks were impressive, but neither so long nor so sharp as Geryon remembered them. Besides, it was cold in the cooling room, and sore muscles stiffened quickly in chilly places. There was no point in trying to visit Barak. The red-bearded man had locked himself in his chamber to brood in blackest melancholy, and refused to answer the door, even to his wife. And so Geryon, left entirely on his own, moped about for a while, and then decided he might as well explore this vast palace, with its dusty, unused chambers and dark, twisting corridors. He walked for what seemed hours, opening doors and following hallways that sometimes ended abruptly against blank stone walls. The palace of Anheg was enormous, having been, as Barak had explained, some 3,000 years and more in construction. One southern wing was so totally abandoned that its entire roof had fallen in centuries ago. Geryon wandered there for a time in the second-floor corridors of the ruin, his mind filled with gloomy thoughts of mortality and transient glory, as he looked into rooms where snow lay thickly on ancient beds and stools, and the tiny tracks of mice and squirrels ran everywhere. Shuck, you say, that's government projects for you. And then he came to an unroofed corridor where there were other tracks, those of a man. The footprints were quite fresh, for there was no sign of snow in them, and it had snowed heavily the night before. At first he thought the tracks might be his own, and that he had somehow circled and come back to a corridor he had already explored, but the footprints were much larger than his. There were a dozen possible explanations, of course, but Geryon felt his breath quicken. The man in the green cloak was still lurking about the palace, Asherak the Murgo was somewhere in Val Alorn, and the flaxen-haired nobleman was hiding somewhere in the forest, with obviously unfriendly intentions. Geryon realized that the situation might be dangerous, and that he was unarmed, except for his small dagger. He retraced his steps quickly to a snowy chamber he had just explored, and took down a rusty sword from a peg where it had hung forgotten for uncountable years. So close, Geryon. So close. This situation is dangerous. I'll retrace my steps. I'll go backwards. Ah, here we go. A sword. No, you were almost there. Then, feeling a bit more secure, he returned to follow the silent tracks. Hoi vey, Geryon. So long as the path of the unknown intruder lay in that roofless and long-abandoned corridor, Following him was simplicity itself. The undisturbed snow made tracking easy. But once the trail led over a heap of fallen debris and into the gaping blackness of a dusty corridor where the roof was still intact, things became a bit more difficult. The dust on the floor helped, but it was necessary to do a great deal of stooping and bending over. Garion's ribs and legs were still sore, and he winced and grunted each time he had to bend down to examine the stone floor. In a very short while he was sweating and gritting his teeth, and thinking about giving the whole thing up. Then he heard a faint sound far down the corridor ahead. He shrank back against the wall, hoping that no light from behind him would filter dimly through to allow him to be seen. Far ahead, a figure passed stealthily through the pale light from a single tiny window. Garion caught a momentary flicker of green, and knew finally whom he was following. He kept close to the wall and moved with cat-like silence in his soft leather shoes, the rusty sword gripped tightly in his hand. If it had not been for the startling nearness of the voice of the Earl of Selene, however, he would probably have walked directly into the man he had been following. "Is it at all possible, noble Belgarath, that our enemy can be awakened before all the conditions of the ancient prophecy are met?" the Earl was asking. The ancient prophecy, you say? Garion stopped. Directly ahead of him, in the narrow embrasure in the wall of the corridor, he caught sight of a slight movement. The green-cloaked man lurked there, listening in the dimness to the words that seemed to come from somewhere beneath. Garion shrank back against the wall, scarcely daring to breathe. Carefully, he stepped backward until he found another embrasure. Is that how that's pronounced? Embrasure? Embrasure. That's definitely one of those words that I've only ever read before and not said aloud. And drew himself into the concealing darkness. "A most appropriate question, Belgarath," the quiet voice of Chohag of the Algars said. "Can this apostate use the power now in his hands to revive the accursed one?"
"The power's there,"
the familiar voice of Mr. Wolf said. Internet says I'm correct? Okay.
"But he might be afraid to use it. If it isn't done properly, the power will destroy him. He won't rush into such an act, and it's that hesitation."
False alarm. Almost sneezed, then I didn't.
"He won't rush into such an act, and it's that hesitation that gives us the little bit of time we have."
Then Silk spoke. "Didn't you say that he might want the thing for himself? Maybe he plans to leave his master in an undisturbed slumber and use the power he's stolen to raise himself as king in the lands of the Angarax." King Rodar of Drasnia chuckled. "Somehow I don't see the Grolim priesthood so easily relinquishing their power in the lands of Angarak and bowing down to an outsider. The high priest of the Grolims is no mean sorcerer himself, I'm told."
"Forgive me, Rodar," King Anheg said, "but if the power's in the thief's hands, the Grolims won't have any choice but to accept his dominion. I've studied the power of this thing, and if even half of what I've read is true, he can use it to rip down Rak Kthol as easily as you'd kick apart an anthill. Then, if they still resist, he could depopulate all of Kthol Murgos from Rak Koska to the Tolnedran border. No matter what, however, whether it's the apostate or the accursed one who eventually raises that power, the Angarax will follow, and they'll come west. Shouldn't we inform the Arans and Tolnedrans, and the Ulgos as well, about what's happened then? Brand, the Raven Warder, asked. Let's not be taken by surprise again.
I wouldn't be in too much hurry to rouse our southern neighbors, Mr. Wolf said. When Pole and I leave here, we'll be moving south. If Arendia and Tolnedra are mobilizing for war, the general turmoil would only hinder us. The Emperor's legions are soldiers. They can respond quickly when the need arises, and the Arends are always ready for war. The whole kingdom hovers on the brink of general warfare all the time.
It's premature, Aunt Pole's familiar voice agreed. Armies would just get in the way of what we're trying to do. If we can apprehend my father's old pupil and return the thing he pilfered to Riva, the crisis will be past. Let's not stir up the Southerners for nothing.
She's right,
Wolf said. Did I do something there? Wolf said,
There's always a risk in a mobilization. A king with an army on his hands usually starts to think of mischief. I'll advise the king of the Arends at Vomimbre and the emperor at Tolhoneth of as much as they need to know as I pass through. But we should get word through to the Gorim of Ulgo. Chohag, do you think you could get a messenger through to Prolgu at this time of year?
It's hard to say, Ancient One, Chohag said. The passes into those mountains are difficult in the winter. I'll try, though.
Good,
Wolf said.
Beyond that, there's not much more we can do. For the time being, it might not be a bad idea to keep this matter in the family, so to speak. If worse comes to worst, and the Angarax invade again, Eloria at least will be armed and ready. There'll be time for Arendia and the Empire to make their preparations.
King Volrak spoke then in a troubled voice. It's easy for the Alorn kings to talk of war, he said. Alorns are warriors, but my Sandaria is a peaceful kingdom. We don't have castles or fortified keeps, and my people are farmers and tradesmen. Kaltorak made a mistake when he chose the battlefield at Vomimbre. It's not likely that the Angarax will make the same mistake again. I think they'll strike directly across the grasslands of northern Algaria and fall upon Sandaria. We have a lot of food and very few soldiers. Our country would provide an ideal base for a campaign in the west, and I'm afraid that we'd fall quite easily. Then, to Garion's amazement, Dernick spoke. Don't cheapen the men of Sandaria so, Lord King, he said in a firm voice. I know my neighbors, and they'll fight. We don't know very much about swords and lances, but we'll fight. If Angarax come to Sandaria, they won't find the taking as easy as some might imagine, and if we put torches to the fields and storehouses, there won't be all that much food for them to eat. There was a long silence, and then Volrak spoke again in a voice strangely humble. Your words shame me, Goodman Dernick, he said. Maybe I've been king for so long that I've forgotten what it means to be a Sandar. One remembers that there are only a few passes leading through the western escarpment into Sandaria, Hetar, the son of King Chohag, said quietly. A few avalanches in the right places could make Sandaria as inaccessible as the moon. If the avalanches took place at the right times, whole armies of Angarax
might find themselves trapped in those narrow corridors.
Oh, I see.
Now that's an entertaining thought, Silk chuckled. Then we could let Dernick put his incendiary impulses to a better use than burning turnip patches. Since Torak One-Eye seems to enjoy the smell of burning sacrifices so much, we might be able to accommodate him. Far down the dusty passageway in which he was hiding, Geryon caught the sudden flicker of a torch and heard the faint jingling of several male shirts. He almost failed to recognize the danger until the last instant. The man in the green cloak also heard the sounds and saw the light of the torch. He stepped from his hiding place and fled back the way he had come, directly past the embrasure where Geryon had concealed himself. Geryon shrank back, clutching his rusty sword, but as luck had it, the man was looking back over his shoulder at the twinkling torch as he ran by on soft feet. As soon as he had passed, Geryon also slipped out of his hiding place and fled. The Cherek warriors were looking for intruders, and it might be difficult to explain what he was doing in the dark hallway. He briefly considered following the spy again, but decided that he'd had enough of that for one day. It was time to tell someone about the things he'd seen. Someone had to be told, someone to whom the kings would listen. Once he reached the more frequented corridors of the palace, he firmly began to make his way toward the chamber where Barak brooded in silent melancholy.
And that's the end of chapter 16. We're on page 214 now. Chapter 17 is 12 pages long, but I think that's probably a good enough amount of reading for tonight, as much as I really do want to continue. We're in the thick of it now. It's tense. Spies. Geryon's caught up in the middle of it. What do y'all think? Are you upset that we have to stop here? I mean, I say have to, but you know. Is everyone enjoying this part of the book? We actually got to listen in on one of those royal councils, whether or not they invited Geryon. Intrigue, Farmos says. Sharkies, again, that whole military conversation was bookended by Geryon following the spy and hanging out in that hallway. The suspense. Well, he's decided that he needs to tell someone, and he's on his way to do so. So maybe Geryon will actually let somebody else know what's going on in this next chapter. Maybe. Oh. I think Puppy senses that we're almost done here. His puppy sense is tingling. If he can. That's true. Barak hasn't been opening his door for anyone. We'll see whether Geryon can convince him otherwise. And Geryon hasn't spoken to Barak since their excitement in the forest. And his whole, I can't say certain things. That's true. We'll see whether or not this is contained within those things. I'm looking forward to next Wednesday now, all of a sudden. This part 2, like Cherek, part 2 of this book, feels like There's a bit of a lead up. There's a couple of chapters where it's a little slower, but then a lot happens real quick. Oh, there's the puppy. There's the puppy. You. Yeah, you with the waggy tail. You're the puppy. Don't worry, I'm almost done. Sharky say it's quite a different pace than the first 2/3 of the book, which had an urgency. The last 2 chapters before this one, he almost went sledding, and a bunch of them had a boar killing romp. He just came for a brief visit. I mean, I don't think the first 2/3 of the book had an urgency. Not all of it. Because there was a lot of also, rafting on a pond and jumping into hay bales and scrubbing pots in the scullery and things of that nature. With little bits of excitement sprinkled in of more intense moments. Unless I'm misreading and you once the main arc showed it said, yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Once we got past the early days of Garion's childhood. So you get a lot of background on him. But, yeah, the first few chapters of Cherrick, you get a little bit of an introduction to Val Alorn. This is what life is like here. People are a little more energetic, a little more, I don't know, a little more highs and lows in their day-to-day life, maybe. But then, it's not bad, just a very different path than you usually expect, say the Sharkies. Yes, the writing style, and it's also worth, remembering that this is book 1 of 5 that are all one consecutive story, right? There's so we'll see. That's gonna be something else. We're coming close to the end of this book, and we'll have to see whether everyone wants to just keep going straight into Queen of Sorcery, I believe is the next book. And we don't need to make that decision until we get to the end of this one, but something to think about. Whether if we're all having a good time, then maybe we'll skip the usual whole voting stream, the voting day, and just move straight on. And if people want to intersperse something else instead, then we can figure that out at the end of this one. Sharky say there are some similarities in the feeling of the story to Tamora Pierce's Alana books. I have not read those. I'm sure I've read some Tamora Pierce. But I would need to take a look at some of the titles to remember what specifically I have read, because I don't remember off the top of my head whether I have for sure, and if so, what. Perhaps that's partially because they were published close to each other. Either one being influenced by the other, or maybe both being influenced by some other third thing. Could be. Yeah. Chapter 16 or 17. We finished chapter 16. And I don't know. I think things are going to get pretty exciting. 1970s to 80s young adult fantasy feel. Yeah, definitely. There's definitely a specific style to that. I mean, to be fair, I probably personally have not read a lot of more recent young adult fantasy. So, I've read, I guess, there's definitely that sort of like teen romantic fantasy thing that has become more prevalent in since the 2000s, maybe, Twilight and and I don't know if that's exactly the right, if I'm maybe painting with too broad a brush here, because I was going to say Hunger Games. I don't know. I haven't actually read Hunger Games. but the sort of dystopian fantasy, I guess, maybe, of like Hunger Games and what's that like? There's something City of Bones. I don't know what that's from. More modern young adult fantasy is more interpersonal, less epic. Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe that's accurate. Maze Runner, right? I mean, then you've also got like Percy Jackson. That's a little more recent, right? It's the Mortal Instruments series. Shadow and Bones. Yeah. Okay. Percy Jackson is the last 15 years. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. I guess recent is somewhat relative, but in talking about, generations of books, I think Percy Jackson kind of fits a little more modernly. Percy Jackson to me felt, I mean, I read the first Percy Jackson book, The Lightning Thief, right? I read that one, and I enjoyed it. It did feel a little bit more like an attempt at a different genre of Harry Potter sort of style. Maybe that's doing it a disservice or something, but it felt a little bit like, boy discovers, that he has powers that most people don't, goes to a place to learn about those powers. It felt like there was a similarity. Sharkies say there's a shift that happened around late 90s. Yeah. Well, I have been enjoying reading this. I'm looking forward to getting into the next chapters. I'm looking forward to Wednesday, like I said already. So, yeah, I don't know. Is Lily here? Does Lily have a suggestion for someone we should raid? Oh, I don't know who's streaming right now. Farmhouse is not the target audience for those books anymore. What? You're a young adult. Maybe not a young adult, like you're not a teenager. Sharkies, I somewhat am, but have a reading list 25 miles long. I've got... If you might recommend one, please. Always feel free to recommend. As far as reading goes, right now I'm reading a lot. Like I'm doing the stream, so I'm reading this every twice a week. And then outside of that, I've got D&D stuff that's requiring some reading. And then if I find myself with some spare time to read outside of the stream and outside of D&D, I've got a lot of manga to read and a lot of comics. And I somewhat recently reread the first Dragonlance book because it's been a while and I don't think I have had read any of the Dragonlance books since actually having experience playing Dungeons and Dragons. So I kind of wanted to go back and look at it through that lens a little bit. Which, I haven't continued that series yet, but I plan on continuing. I can see Puppy. See Puppy's face just down the stairs looking at me. Right here. Here's Puppy's face. Elatso by Darcy Little Badger, published late 2020, so very recent. Modern indigenous young adult fantasy mixes old fantasy elements, fairies, etc., and indigenous fantasy beautifully, and it's a mystery. It's very intriguing. I feel like with something that recent, if I were going to want to read it on stream, I would want to contact the author first. Like, try and find an email address or something and explain what I'm doing here and ask permission. Most of this stuff, it's one of your favorite books of the last 3 years. Nice. Everything we've read here so far has been out for decades, and so I've just I haven't really asked anyone permission. I don't know whether I'm supposed to or not. I've just kind of gone with it, these, let's read a book. But with something that recent, if we were gonna do that, and I've also, of course, only read things that I have personally read previously. That's not like a hard fast rule for me. Not necessarily recommending it for stream. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that, but I guess I kind of did imply that. You're not necessarily recommending it for stream, just as a great book to read in general. Yeah. But I mean, it might be neat to read something more recent at some point. But yeah, I think I would have to first contact either the author or their like publisher or something. I would try to contact the author specifically, I think, because I think first of all, maybe they'd be entertained by the idea, and second of all, I think I might be more likely to get an affirmative from the author than from a publisher. I feel like I would just get shut down automatically by a publisher. Farmos has been reading Natasha Pulley's historical fantasy, starting with The Watchmaker of Filigree Street. Sister, mother, and I all read it over the span of a week-long vacation together. Well, read the first book. You're in the third one. So I haven't seen a reply from Lily, and I don't have anyone that I can see is streaming right now. I suppose I could like try and check whether any of the people we've rated before. Let's try some of the ones that I remember. Yeah, it looks like Slightly Stupid Bear is streaming, so why don't we raid Slightly Stupid Bear? So I'll start that. And yeah, so have a good weekend. It was very nice to see you all here. As I've said twice already, I'm looking forward already to next Wednesday to getting on with, we're getting real close to the end of this book, and there is going to be some excitement ahead. Spoiler warning. Not a very big spoiler, but minor spoiler warning. There will be excitement. All right. Have a good weekend. See you next Wednesday. Okay, I'm going to start this raid. Stick around at least till it goes through, and then, have a good night.